The reunion of Noa Argamani with her Israeli father was especially moving, as Noa had become one of the most famous and most recognized hostages in the country. We had seen the terror in her eyes and in her voice as we had watched the video of Noa being captured, kidnapped on October 7th and driven into Gaza on the back of a motorcycle. We'd heard her screaming to her friend to save her and to her captors not to kill her. Good evening and welcome to a very special edition of the Rosenberg Report. After traveling to Washington, D.C. and Indianapolis in recent days to speak and do interviews and meet with evangelical leaders here in the United States about the latest developments in Israel, I'm in Virginia Beach tonight continuing to meet with evangelical leaders, and I'm eager to take you inside this extraordinary and I would say truly miraculous rescue operation that saved the lives of 4 Israeli hostages, but has also unleashed a tidal wave of international condemnation. Lots to get to tonight, but let's start with the most important story. How in the world did Israel pull off such an astonishing and miraculous rescue? It all begins several weeks ago when Israeli intelligence discovered the location of 4 Israeli hostages. Noa Argamani, 25 years old, Almog Meir John, 21 years old, Andrei Kozlov, 27, and Shlomo Ziv, 40 years old, in the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza. Now, the 3 men were not being held in Hamas terror tunnels, but they were being held rather in a private apartment of a Palestinian journalist who has worked for Al Jazeera. About 200 yards away, Noa Argamani was being held in another private civilian apartment. All 4 were under heavy guard by Hamas gunmen, but it's important to note that they were surrounded by a combination of civilian families and terror operatives. Now, for weeks, Israeli intelligence secretly monitored the apartment buildings, studying the floor plans, studying the streets and the neighborhoods, studying the patterns of what was happening there, and helping the IDF and an elite counterterrorism police unit known as Yamam develop a rescue plan. Soon, Israeli special forces and Yamam operatives were secretly training every single day in 2 buildings that were built by the Israeli government, by the Israeli military, to exact specifications to replicate the buildings these operatives would be going into. Israeli commanders chose Saturday, June 8th at 11:30 a.m. in broad daylight to move. Why? Because a daylight operation, they concluded, would catch the terrorists completely by surprise. They would not, the terrorists would not expect the Israelis coming in during daylight. Also, operating in daylight would help the Israeli commandos to identify and recognize the hostages and distinguish them from their Hamas captors. As the first units moved into position, the men were dressed as Palestinian refugees, driving a beat-up old truck, carrying mattresses, and telling local residents in fluent, perfect Palestinian Arabic that they were from Rafah, the most southernmost city in Gaza, and that they were relocating to this neighborhood in the Nuseirat refugee camp to be safe from the IDF. Now, the women commandos dressed like veiled Arab women to blend in. Both teams had to move and strike simultaneously. But first, the IDF had to create a diversion. So they used airstrikes and ground forces, and they started attacking buildings in a nearby neighborhood that they knew from intelligence and from observation were filled with Hamas terrorists. This caused chaos. It started causing other terrorists to rush to that neighborhood and away from the 2 buildings where the hostages were being located. The diversion was working. The 2 special forces teams, once they were informed that the diversion was working as planned, these teams started moving in like lightning, breaking into both apartment buildings simultaneously. They took out the Hamas terrorists, killed them all, and then shouted at the hostages in Hebrew to stay calm and stay down. Noa Argamani was washing dishes in the kitchen of the civilian family where she was being held. At first, she didn't even believe that the commandos were really IDF soldiers. But as she saw and heard the gunfire increasing around her and her captors dead and dying, she became quickly convinced this was really happening. But this was just the beginning. As Noa was fitted with a bulletproof vest and rushed out of the building into an armored car, and driven out of Nuzarat, the rescue of the 3 men was not going as planned. Hundreds of Hamas terrorists suddenly realized that there was a diversion and that these hostages were being rescued by the Israeli forces. And as they realized that, they began opening fire on the men's getaway vehicle, and it quickly became disabled. The Israeli Air Force had planned for this, and they had a plan. They began heavy airstrikes on those Hamas positions, creating what one IDF commander called a ring of fire around their commandos and the 3 rescued hostages and the disabled truck. It worked. The IDF was able to get a second vehicle to the location amidst the firefight, move the male hostages, freed hostages, out of that vehicle and into the new vehicle amidst this intense firefight, complete with machine gun fire and RPG fire. Before long, Noa, Almog, Andre, and Shlomi were arriving at a secure beach on the shores of the Mediterranean. There, they boarded 2 separate helicopters. Noa was in one, the 3 men in another. And once those choppers lifted off safely and headed for Israel, the code word was radioed back to the IDF command center in Tel Aviv: the diamonds are in our hands.
אני רוצה לדווח לך ששלושת היהלומים המריאו כרגע מהמנחת לכיוון הארץ.
As the news broke across Israel of the daring, dangerous, and miraculous rescue of 4 Israeli hostages, at least one Israeli newscaster couldn't contain his emotions. It was moving to me, it was moving to people all over the country. Israelis enjoying a day at the beach erupted in cheers as one of the lifeguards passed on the news. And soon, families of the hostages were arriving at a hospital in Tel Aviv to see and embrace their loved ones for the first time since they were taken hostage by Hamas terrorists at the Nova Music and Dance Festival in southern Israel 8 months earlier. The still images of these reunions and the videos were soon flashing across TV sets and social media channels all over Israel and all over the world. And I have to tell you that I immediately broke down in tears. I just was emotionally overwhelmed with gratitude, first for the soldiers, the bravery of what they had done, the intelligence operatives, everybody involved in this complex operation, but also with gratitude to the Lord for setting these 4 captives free after the prayers of millions and millions of people all over the world for so long. And I was asking the Lord through those tears to show the same mercy to the 120 hostages that still remain in Gaza, including 5 Americans. The reunion of Noa Argamani with her Israeli father was especially moving, as Noa had become one of the most famous and most recognized hostages in the country. We had seen the terror in her eyes and in her voice as we had watched the video of Noa being captured, kidnapped on October 7th and driven into Gaza on the back of a motorcycle. We'd heard her screaming to her friends to save her and to her captors not to kill her. We had also come to learn that her Chinese mother is battling stage 4 brain cancer and has been pleading with Hamas through the media to release Noa so they could embrace at least one last time before she dies. Now, many evangelicals, my family included, have been praying especially for Noa's release, for all of them, of course, but we've sort of been drawn to Noa's story, her family's story, and we've been praying for her release or her rescue, and for her mother to be supernaturally healed and spared death and restored to her daughter. And so please keep praying with us. Now that they're back together, please pray for the healing of Noa's mother. So far, no photos or video of Noa and her mom have been released, but the ones of Noa and her dad, her Israeli dad, crying and hugging, have captured the heart of every Israeli. Soon, Israeli TV broadcast video of Noa receiving a phone call from Israeli President Isaac Herzog, welcoming her home and asking her to accept a hug, a virtual hug from him on behalf of a grateful and suddenly very joyous nation. Within hours, we started seeing video and photos of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with, hugging, and praising all 4 freed hostages. Honestly, all of us in Israel were living a dream suddenly. After so much pain, darkness, death, and depression, we finally had something to celebrate, and celebrate we did. And yet, we were soon jolted by some terrible news. We suddenly learned that one of the valiant commanders of the rescue operation, a gentleman by the name of Arnon Zamora, was shot and critically wounded by Hamas terrorists during the extraction operation. And then, hours later, we learned that Arnon had succumbed to his wounds and was dead. The good news there is that the Israeli government decided to name the entire rescue operation Operation Arnon in his memory and to honor that he had laid down his life for his countrymen. And so that is special, but we are grieving with his family and friends Arnon's loss. But that wasn't all. The following day, Israelis learned that the father of Almog Meir John, one of those hostages that had been released, the father died alone in his apartment just hours before Almog was rescued. Racked by grief, family members and friends explained that Almog's father had been battling depression for months since October 7th, and that he died, they say, of a broken heart. He simply couldn't take the grief any longer. And tragically, I mean, this is really unbelievable. He died without ever knowing that his son had finally just been freed by Israeli forces. It just, it took the wind out of our sails in many ways. And then came more bitter news as one world leader after another over the next few hours and days began condemning Israel's rescue operation. Now, why in the world would they do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because Hamas's so-called health ministry in Gaza told reporters that more than 270 innocent Palestinian civilians had been killed and more than 700 wounded during the Israeli liberation rescue operation on Saturday. And most of the media immediately ran with the story, immediately accepted the word of Hamas, parroting the Hamas messaging and accusing Israel of massacring Palestinians. Now, the IDF quickly agreed in a statement that the Palestinians had been killed in the operation, but they argued two different points. First, that it wasn't as many as the Hamas health ministry said. It was far fewer. But more importantly, the IDF was arguing that the vast majority of the Palestinians that were killed on Saturday were, in fact, Hamas terrorists. Some who had been holding the 4 Israelis hostage in those apartments, other Hamas terrorists who had been guarding the apartment buildings and the neighborhoods in other buildings and apartments around the ones where the hostages were held. And others that were killed were Hamas terrorists who had engaged IDF forces with heavy machine gun fire and rocket-propelled grenades. And the Palestinian civilians were also killed, yes, including a journalist working with Al Jazeera, as I mentioned. But these Palestinian civilians weren't innocent. The Israelis argued that they had been aiding and abetting Hamas's efforts to secretly hold these 4 Israelis in the Nuseirat refugee camp. Now, were some of those killed truly innocent civilians? Okay, very likely, possibly, probably, let's say. But whose fault is that? That's an important question. Well, Hamas should never have taken innocent Israeli civilians hostage in the first place. Hamas should never have held Israeli civilians captive for 8 months. Hamas should never have held Israeli hostages in private homes, in private neighborhoods, surrounded by Palestinian civilians, including women, children, and babies that Hamas was using purposefully, not accidentally, but purposefully, as human shields. And when the IDF came to rescue our people, Hamas didn't have to start a massive firefight in a civilian neighborhood with hundreds of Hamas terrorists opening fire and putting everyone in the neighborhoods at risk. And yet, that's what Hamas did. And yet, the condemnations from the world came not against Hamas, but against Israel. Joseph Borrell, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and honestly, I have to tell you, one of the most anti-Israel and most anti-Semitic leaders on the planet today, immediately wrote on X, the social media channel formerly known as Twitter, quote, and I quote here, "Reports from Gaza of another massacre of civilians are appalling. We condemn this in the strongest terms. This bloodbath must end immediately." But not to be outdone, came Francesca Albanese. Now, she's the special rapporteur handling the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for the United Nations. And I have to tell you, another one of the most hostile, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic leaders, unfair, biased, and cruel. One of the most horrible leaders I've seen in this modern age. She immediately rushed to X, to Twitter, to write this screed, quote, Israel has used hostages to legitimize killing, injuring, maiming, starving, and traumatizing Palestinians in Gaza. Unquote for just a second. Do you hear what she's saying? That Israel is taking advantage of us having hostages, and that it's actually that we want to maim, that we want to starve, that we want to murder, that we want to traumatize Palestinians. This is unbelievable. She's a top UN official. Back to her quote. Quote, and while intensifying in violence against Palestinians in the rest of the occupied territories and in Israel, Israel could have freed all of the hostages. They could have had them alive and intact 8 months ago, she says, she claims, when the first ceasefire and hostage exchange was put on the table. Yet, she's arguing, quote, Israel refused to take them all in order to continue to destroy Gaza and the Palestinians as a people. And she goes on to say, this is genocidal intent turned into action. And she writes, it's crystal clear. Well, it is not crystal clear, except her hatred for Israel, her hatred for Jews. I'll tell you what's clear. This is clear. According to this top UN official, Israel is not allowed to rescue its own citizens. And while we're rescuing them, we're not supposed to protect our people from hundreds of terrorists unleashing machine gun fire and RPG fire on our troops and on our innocent civilian hostages? And if Israelis do fight back and large numbers of terrorists die in the process, Israel is guilty of genocide? Do you see how crazy this is? Do you see how deranged and despicable such accusations are? But many in the media are parroting such insanity without pause, without reflection, painting Israel, not the terrorists, not the kidnappers, but Israelis as the bad guys in the eyes of hundreds of millions of readers and viewers around the world. And then there was this. A BBC anchor was interviewing my friend Jonathan Conriquez, a former IDF spokesman, about the rescue operation. But she simply couldn't help herself as she relentlessly criticized the IDF for the way they rescued our 4 hostages. She asked Jonathan why the IDF hadn't warned Palestinians in the neighborhood ahead of time so that they could get to safety. Now, Jonathan handles this ridiculous premise like a pro. But as I watched the exchange, I found myself astonished. I shouldn't be astonished, but I am astonished yet again that so much of the mainstream media will find a way, any way, to blame Israel, to blame Jews every single chance they get. This is what we're up against. A world of billion-dollar media giants, media Goliaths, actually, who hate God, who hate His Word, hate His people, and hate the truth. But my colleagues here on the Rosenberg Report, and of course my team at All Israel News and All Arab News, we refuse to be intimidated. Yeah, we're outmanned, outspent, and outgunned by these media giants, by these modern-day Goliaths. But so what? Are we going to be silenced by these Goliaths? Coerced? Canceled? Never. We're going to keep doing what God has called us to do. We're going to keep speaking, reporting, publishing, and broadcasting the truth every day. We're going to do it in love. We'll do it with fairness and respect, but we're not going to be fearful. And we're going to do it we're going to report these truths without fear or favor. And that's a promise that you can count on.